Agri-Food. I'll start with just a few reminders. You know the format, but we are taking place in hybrid format, and the proceedings will be made available via the House of Commons website. Just so you're aware, the webcast will always show the person speaking rather than the entirety of the committee. And of course, screenshots or taking photos of your screen is not permitted. Couple notes here, colleagues. We have Ms. Hetty Fry subbing in for Ms. Taylor Roy. Welcome to the committee, Ms. Fry. And we also have Mr. Epp subbing in for Mr. Barlow this evening. Pursuant to order of reference of Wednesday, May 17th, 2023, the committee will commence its consideration of Bill C-280, an act to amend the Bankruptcy and Insolvency Act and the Companies Creditors Arrangement Act, deemed trust, perishable fruits and vegetables. And I would now like to welcome the sponsor of the bill for the first 1 hour panel. That is Mr. Davidson, Mr. Scott Davidson, the Member of Parliament for York Simcoe. I do want the record to show, of course, Mr. Simcoe helped bring some vegetables from the area, and we certainly appreciate that, all committee members. I'll leave it for folks at home to see. Good job, Mr. Davidson. We're all proud of our horticulture sector, and I know that it exists in your riding. Before I turn it over to you for 5 minutes for your opening remarks, I would be remiss without recognizing Theo and Diane Rood, who are the parents of Leanne Rood. They are in the committee gallery in the back. Great to have you here on Parliament Hill with us, and you should be very proud of your daughter. She's a tremendous member of Parliament. But Mr. Davidson, over to you for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and good evening. I guess we'll say good evening. I'm very excited to be here at Ag Committee tonight, and I'm very grateful for the unanimous support Bill C-280 received at second reading. And I look forward to further cooperation as we work to pass this bill. Together, we can finally establish a limited deemed trust for our hardworking produce farmers right across this great country. This couldn't be a more pressing and timely issue right now. Earlier this month, a Statistics Canada report showed that there was a significant decline in fresh fruit and vegetable availability for Canadians in 2022. This year also saw a high-profile bankruptcy of Lakeside Produce in Leamington, Ontario, which had crippling financial implications for the entire produce industry. This was followed up by an in-depth article in the Toronto Star, The End of Lettuce, where it was reported that more than 3/4 of all produce consumed in Canada is imported. This threatens Canada's food security, as access to fresh produce from foreign markets is increasingly being jeopardized by climate change, trade protections, and supply chain issues. According to experts cited in that article, Canada was, quote, previously way more self-reliant in fresh fruit and vegetables. We produced a lot more of what we consume domestically, but since World War II, all that has seriously deteriorated, largely because there's limited policy supports for produce growers compared to the grain or animal sectors, unquote. At its core, Bill C-280 is a recognition of the need to support Canada's produce sector, just as we support other agricultural sectors by ensuring that Canada's bankruptcy laws recognize the particular challenges and demands of growing and selling fresh fruits and vegetables. This is achieved by establishing a limited deemed trust for produce sellers, which would give them priority access to the proceeds of sale, limited to only the inventory, accounts receivable, and cash on hand derived from the sale of produce during the bankruptcy proceedings of an insolvent produce buyer. This will help offset the loss of their sold produce. The mechanism accounts for the especially perishable nature of fresh produce and the typical payment term that exists in the industry, both of which are significant deficiencies of the agricultural protection and dispute resolution mechanisms that currently exist. There is a clear need for financial protection for Canada's fresh fruit and vegetable growers. This very committee has acknowledged as much on multiple occasions. You might think that no one reads your report, but Mr. Chair, I do. I spend day and night reading agriculture reports and Senate committee reports. It's unbelievable. Bill C-280 enacts the very protections this committee has recommended the government put in place. It will strengthen an industry whose supply chain supports more than 249,000 jobs in Canada, amounting to $9.8 billion in wages. It will make our food security more resilient by reducing losses in an agriculture subsector that experiences more bankruptcies than most others. It will enhance the affordability and the accessibility of fresh fruits and vegetables for Canadians. The reduction in costs for Canadian consumers will save as much as 5 to 15% on their annual fresh fruit and vegetable purchases. And it will open the door to reinstating reciprocal access to the Financial Protection Establishment by the Perishable Agricultural Commodities Act in the United States, which will be greatly support Canadian exporters who have been disadvantaged for far too long, despite the significant volume of produce sold to buyers in the U.S. every day. Here today, Mr. Chair, we have an obligation to support our Canadian farmers. Instead of dire warnings of the end of lettuce, Bill C-280 represents the beginning of something more. Canada's produce sector can be positioned not only to feed Canada, but to feed the world like never before. Thank you to the committee, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Davidson, for your opening remarks. I think you hit it spot on that this committee has been calling for this type of initiative, this type of legislation for quite some time. And frankly, I'll call it multi-partisan support across the board. And you saw that reflected at second reading. But we do want to dig in and ask questions and talk about the impetus of why this bill is coming forward and some of the pieces in the legislation. And Mr. Epp, you're going to have the first chance to take a crack at Mr. Davidson for up to 6 minutes. Over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to my colleague, Mr. Davidson, my colleague and friend from the Soup and Salad Bowl. I believe I have the honor of probably representing the highest vegetable production gross value anyway. Not that we would ever compete or be competitive, but ours is both the greenhouse sector and the processing sector in our riding. You mentioned the lakeside produce, and this is just about a sampling of the letters that came into my office encouraging us in this committee to look at 280. So I very much appreciate bringing that forward. Lakeside produce, it has a chilling and devastating effect, so I appreciate you bringing that out. It's been brought out that only 0.1% of the transactions of the values end up in bankruptcy, and that's been one of the challenges back to this legislation. Why is it still needed if only 0.1%? Of the transactions end up in bankruptcy?
Well, thank you for your question. And through you, Mr. Chair, I would challenge. I think the Soup and Salad Bowl is the largest in the Holland Marsh in York Simcoe. This is a needed piece of legislation. You know, it's going to encourage more growth in the agriculture sector, number one. Just the very nature of having this protection, you know, I'll let the committee understand this. One of the first things that happened to me in COVID in York Simcoe was right when COVID hit. I was out in the riding in the Holland Marsh one day. I had a farmer come up to me and he said, "Scott, I don't think I'm going to plant my field." And I said, "You know, Ken, why is that?" He says, "I'm so worried about getting paid. I don't know what's going to happen to these big companies, these big distributors." That was all the unknown to us. And he said, "You know, I can sit at home and basically pay the taxes on my farm and not plant. And if I do plant, it's going to cost me $2 million. And Scott, if I don't get paid, I'm going to lose this third generation farm." And he said, "I'm actually here not looking for a handout from the government. I'm just looking for assurances that I'm going to get paid for my produce." So that's why, you know, this legislation is so important for people like Ken, and obviously for people that were affected by Leamington. That was a $183 million bankruptcy, I believe.
Bankruptcy and Insolvency Act allows for 15 days for someone that's not getting paid to make a claim. Why doesn't that work?
There's a whole bunch of different things as I investigated this bill, whether it was insurance in different sectors. The 30 days was a chosen amount of days when we looked at the legislation. Why we chose that? Because it does work for farmers. This was, you know, about listening to our fresh produce farmers. I'm sure you have spoke to them in Leamington. You probably do take us on tomatoes, Dave, but that's why the 30 days was.
Yeah, exactly. The 15 days, I know from the vegetable growers I've represented over most of my career, you don't know that you're not being paid. Often the terms of sale are extended past the 15 days, and your lien protections under the existing legislation have run out. Other sectors have created financial protection funds where the seller, actually pool an insurance fund. And I know in the past in the processing sector, that has turned into an operating fund for processors way back, and so the sector did away with that. I know it exists in some other sectors. Why do you think it wouldn't work in fresh? And I know it wouldn't.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of, you know what, there's a whole bunch of different mechanisms out there, whether we look at grain, whether we look at pork, whether we look at dairy. This was a mechanism that farmers came to me that suggested this would work the best for them. And so through this whole process, it was listening to farmers which would work the best for them and really the simplest, Dave.
Exactly, and exactly. It looks like you've looked at all the alternatives. As you've brought this legislation forward, have you faced pushback? Where have the roadblocks been pointed out to you, if there are any?
You know what? I think after seeing what this committee has studied, and you know, members of the committee can correct me if I'm wrong, farmers have been looking for this legislation for a while. I think this committee's recommended this 3 times in the past to the government, and I'm just really happy, I got to be honest, that everyone voted for this, and I think we're going to be able to work together. This is a good, robust bill, and I want to see it get passed.
Can you talk about what this does for us with our largest trading partner, the U.S., and a little bit of the history, you know, between PACA? That's what we call this PACA. Why do we call it PACA?
Well, it's a Perishable Food Act. There was a number of things, and I think members will allude to that. You know, having the reciprocal, if this gets passed, there was a letter relating to this earlier that was alluded to, that we would get reciprocity with the U.S. I think, you know, we have to look at this whole bill as giving our fresh produce farmers certainty in the market. That's what they're looking for. And I think it's a sector in Canada, you know, I've talked about this before. You know, you can move a General Motors plant, but you can't move a farm. We are blessed in Canada with the most arable land. And this is one sector, I believe, you know, that it should be. And this isn't a partisan comment. You know, when I looked at the budget, I believe in looking for a vision of the country. You know, one of the visions for Canada should be agriculture. That should be something that we're pushing. We should be doing everything we can do for agriculture to become #1 in the world, right? Right from Ontario, Quebec, right from coast to coast to coast, and have that as a vision for the country. Even we go into, you know, non-OECD countries and you know, teach people how to grow food, how to make fresh water. You know, this is an industry that I believe in. I know everyone in this room believes in. That's why we're all here together. And I just think this is a great piece of legislation that we got to try and get this.
We'll keep it
Thank
at
you,
that,
Mr. Chair. I've used up my 20 seconds that I donated the last time I was
Yeah,
here.
there you go. We're all square now. Mr. Drouin, 6 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Davidson, welcome to committee. And congratulations on earning the opportunity to present a private member's bill. Not every member of parliament gets to have the honor in this place, and I want to be thankful to you to presenting a bill that I can certainly line up behind. Just a quick few questions. Obviously, you've mentioned it. The committee has recommended on multiple occasions that PACA should be a bill that we should move forward with, but oftentimes the Dispute Resolution Corporation has been raised up. And why do you feel that that particular mechanism does not answer the current needs in the Canadian market?
I think, you know, when we spoke to, and you know, this legislation was drafted speaking to a number of people and a number of farmers, and speaking to everyone, and I know there's going to be experts behind me that are going to be able to, you know, nail down exactly what is in the DRC, but this was the needed piece of legislation that was the simplest that we could see, you know, in the fresh fruit and vegetable sector for some sort of financial protection that would work the simplest, right, with the 30-day terms.
Yeah, and obviously the DRC, and I think you've mentioned, my colleague Mr. Epp mentioned the reciprocity in the U.S., and that assurance, are we getting that from the U.S. if your bill passes? Because obviously we know that once PACA was passed in the U.S., and we didn't have, the U.S. didn't feel that we had a reciprocal agreement in Canada, then it required our Canadian producers to make a deposit, which obviously affects cash flow. Do we have that particular assurance that if your bill passes, that our Canadian exporters will no longer have to put that deposit down, and we can say, yeah, we've got the environmental regulatory framework in place in Canada to replicate what you guys have in the U.S. Everybody's assured, and we can give that access back to Canadian producers and exporters.
Yeah, I truly believe that if this becomes law in Canada, that we're going to get that reciprocity. There was a letter that was issued with the previous Congress that they would like to see that. I think, we've got a great committee here. I don't see why that would change, and it makes sense to do that. This is something that would have been nice to see in the new NAFTA agreement. I think so, but I'm confident. If you send me to Washington, I will get this done. And I know with Cody and everyone, I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, with everyone, we'll get this reciprocity done. It is a new Congress, and I can't speak on behalf of the United States currently right now, but there was a letter a couple years ago that said if we got this done, that would happen. And, I think conditions now, given my comments on COVID, and the challenges that our fresh produce, farmers face, I think even more now, it's more timely for this law. Okay.
And then in terms of often what we've heard in this committee previously is that our financial sector was worried about super priority. Do you have the assurance that this somehow impacts super priority for because let's be honest here, this bill only applies in bankruptcy situations, but it does provide the assurance in case something terrible happens, but it does provide the insurance to our producer community and those who operate up the flow chart, because it's not just about producers, it's also about processors who might deal with retailers. They will get the same guarantees through your bill. And that's certainly something that I've heard from the stakeholders that you would have been dealing with. But have you been approached by the financial sector saying we're worried about this, or silence?
Silence.
Okay.
Silence. I'm confident that how it was drafted, that it is strictly going to be for our fresh fruit and vegetable growers.
Right.
If they sell to the distributors.
Right, and we have, you've mentioned it, there's similar legislation in the U.S. and the banking sector
Correct.
didn't somehow fall apart and everybody went bankrupt because of this, a similar bill in the U.S.
Mm.
Right, okay. With just maybe my last question, Mr. Chair, I've got about 1 minute left. I do see... You've mentioned it, the particulars of your bill. It's 30 days for payment back. Can you explain that, and how? I've heard from some stakeholders that they're worried about those who might tend to finance their particular operations through accounts receivable. They would be worried about this bill because that might change their financial agreements with their banking sector. Are you hearing that, or not at all?
I'm not hearing that at all. The 30 days was an established term talking to the industry. Yep. There was 15, there was 90, there was 60, there was all different terms. 30 was felt that worked the best for people and which was most reasonable.
Right. So for the majority of, I'd be a liar if CPMA hadn't been on us for the last 7 years, since I've been here anyways, if the Canadian Produce Marketing Association wasn't trying to lobby us to present a similar bill to what you've presented, but the majority of their membership is supportive of this, of your efforts.
Yep.
Perfect.
And I think we're gonna. The nice thing is we're gonna hear from them today.
That's great. Thank you.
Boots on the ground.
We'll leave it at that, gentlemen. Thank you. Maintenant, Monsieur Perron.
Mr. Perron, for 6 minutes. Thank you very much for being here today, Mr. Davidson. This is a fantastic bill. I won't say anything compromising while you're putting on your earpiece. All of the political parties voted in favor of this, and I'm very happy about it. As you know, we all can get behind this bill. So today my questions will aim to clarify things. Perhaps there are certain gaps that can be bridged so that it's a better bill and ensure that it is very good, but we are, of course, in favor of it. My first question is something that came up earlier. A statistic that we hear often is that less than 0.1% of total sales in the last years were affected by losses. You reacted to this percentage earlier. How do you explain the fact that right now this percentage is so low?
Well, I think that's sort of a double-loaded question. I think the percentage is actually higher. You know, I spoke to example about Ken during COVID that said, Scott, I don't want to plant my fields because I'm afraid of getting paid. And I said, you know, Ken, don't do that because that's going to lead to, as we all know here, less supply, less produce. Therefore, it's going to mean higher prices for the consumers and on and on and on. And I think, you know, in that one instance, which there was more than that, that actual low number doesn't capture all those Kens that are out there. Number one, that's why I feel that number is low. I think, you know, this legislation will help a lot of small and medium-sized businesses. How much of that was reported, I'm not sure. But I think that number isn't quite right. And, you know, it was interesting not to loop this around on my last PMB on Bill C-204, the export of plastic waste for final disposal. The other issue was the government said, well, Scott, you know, this happened once or twice. It's not happening. We don't need this bill. You know, the fact of the matter was the Fifth Estate went out and tracked shipping containers that were going to Thailand with plastics. They were all being under the cover of darkness, so it was happening. So, you know, I think there was a lot that isn't captured in that statistics. And, you know, there was, you know, I've got a couple farmers in my riding out of that Leamington case that were worried and currently are. That's a huge number. They, you know, they didn't get paid $200,000 in a receivable. A lot of our small and medium-sized farmers can't take that.
Excellent. Et je pense que vous m'avez donné une bonne réponse.
I think that was an excellent answer. And I'm very satisfied with this answer. It's important to expose the feedback and criticism we receive. There are a lot of losses that are not declared. A lot of producers don't have any recourse and are afraid that they will be dealing with a company that is going bankrupt and will only get paid half or a quarter of what they're owed, and they're not accounted for in these statistics. It's important that we name it that. Another objection with regards to banks. People will say, well, if you do this, then you will be prioritizing growers and they might be a bit more skittish in giving credit to certain customers or to other produce growers. What do you think of that?
I would think from the research that we've looked at, it's quite the contrary, and same in the U.S. You know, this, again, is going to give more certainty actually in the marketplace. And I suspect, and even looking at some U.S. data, that it's actually going to help the industry, quite the reverse. That's what I see. So in speaking to farmers and people in that industry, you know, let's face it, these companies that you sell to and distributors are still limited liability companies. There's only going to be so much money in the pot. You know, one of the arguments was, you know, well, farmers are going to start selling to, you know, companies that are in distress. Well, they're still limited liability companies, and that doesn't make sense because there's only going to be so much, you know, money there at the end of the day that's going to be available. So this doesn't become some free-for-all where you're selling to everyone.
Excellente réponse, encore une fois.
Again, a fantastic answer. You said something earlier. You talked about a producer who was a little bit hesitant, and I've received such feedback as well. Some people are afraid of of not having enough workforce or labor during the harvesting season, and so they just don't start at all. There's all this issue with foreign temporary workers, and we all know that fruit and vegetable production is very difficult. It is subject to the weather's whims, and we have to do what we can to help them. I think that your bill is excellent, and we will continue to work for it to be adopted quickly. Thank you.
We'll now turn to Mr. McGregor for up to 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and welcome, Mr. Davidson, to our committee. It's nice to see Bill C-280 come here, and congratulations on getting such a strong showing of support at second reading. I think that's really put a lot of wind into the sails behind this bill. And obviously, from what I've seen from questioning so far, you're getting a pretty favorable response so far. I'm always interested in learning a little bit about what inspired MPs to really come up with their PMBs. You mentioned that particular farmer in your riding. Were there any other examples that kind of led you to take this path?
Well, thank you. And again, I want to thank the NDP, the Bloc, the Greens, the Liberals for all supporting this. You know, it was funny, Alistair, when I first was elected to the House of Commons, I had the Honourable Rob Nicholson pull me aside, and he said, Scott, I came to your riding once, and you had that really black soil and there growing carrots in your riding. And I said, that's right. And he says, you know what I have in my riding is peaches. And he goes, I'm going to give you a tip. He goes, people always ask me, why do I talk about peaches? And he said to me, Scott, it's because if I don't look after peaches, no one else is going to. He says, so you look after carrots in your riding, Scott. So, you know, my riding, of course, is home. I call it the Soup and Salad Bowl of Canada. I'm very proud of the Holland Marsh. It provides 80% of the fresh produce that Ontario consumes. So I think, you know, that was my inspiration to do. I live on a farm myself, but to do something for farmers and for agriculture. Mm-hmm. And I think this is an important bill that's going to help, you know, our fresh produce farmers right across Canada.
And on that point, because I think for like a lot of Canadians, you know, their only experience with fruit and vegetables is being able, like they just want to have access to buy them. They're not necessarily aware of some of the very complex business arrangements that exist in our supply chains. So maybe if you could just paint a picture, like, you know, you brought up the example of the farmer in your riding who was really wondering, is it worth it for me to plant my field because it's I'm gonna have to put up all this money up front, but he was worried about payment. And can you maybe just talk about like the journey produce takes to get to its end destination, but also the journey that payment has to take to get back to the originator, and sort of underline why this kind of a bill is necessary?
Yeah, I think it's well, number one, it's the perishable nature of fresh produce. Whether you want to talk about lettuce, whether you want to talk about carrots, you know, why this bill is so important, number one, it's not like you're selling televisions, for example. You know, if someone doesn't pay you for your TVs, you can go back and try and get your TVs back. There's an inventory item there. But when someone sells strawberries or lettuce, after 30 days, those are rotted. They're either sold or they're rotted in the field. They don't have an opportunity to recapture unsold inventory. So, and again, you know, circling back to my Bloc colleague and of course you, all the challenges that fresh produce farming goes through, especially right now with climate change, with, you know, getting people to work the fields, all the things that have to happen at the end of the day to make this carrot, to make this onion happen, is incredible. Mm-hmm. And, you know, there's big farmers, there's medium-sized farmers, there's small farmers. And I think, you know, that's why this bill is so important, to help that whole sector.
You mentioned that you are a voracious reader of agriculture committee reports, and I commend you on that. You would be aware that, from several of the recommendations we've made over several parliaments dealing with creation of a limited deemed trust, we've also received some government responses on that. And I think some of the frustration has been is that, we've been calling for this for quite some time. The NDP has been running this in our election platform since 2015. But when we get a government response, there's a little bit of equivocation where they state things like, Canada's insolvency laws aim to strike the appropriate balance between competing interests of debtors and creditors. They want to make sure that everyone's being treated equitably and that any changes has to be evidence-based. So, when you hear those types of points being made in a government response to a very clear recommendation that is based on overwhelming witness testimony and submissions to this committee, I mean, what are some of the first things that come to mind, I guess, about how the current process is actually quite unfair, and maybe the government response kind of has glossed that over a little bit?
Yeah. Well, no, thanks for the question, Alistair. I mean, we are all sent here as members of Parliament to represent our constituents, and I know everyone sitting around this table is. And I think it's frustrating that, and I know the Liberal government, the current Liberal government, had this in their policy platform in 2015. And so here we are in 2023, previously to this becoming a PMB, I tried to get this into the Budget Implementation Act, basically pleaded with the Deputy Prime Minister to have this included. I think it would have been a great thing that you could have included in a budget. There was a couple of times that opportunity was missed. So here we are now. I don't think I'm putting words in the mouth of the Minister of Agriculture. I think the last time she was in front of this committee, she felt and said, I think to you, that this, PMB, she was happy to see, and it's a mechanism that we can get this done. And, that makes me positive. We can always talk about the past. I'm here on, I'll call it Team Canada, Team Carrot, Team Agriculture today to get this done. And I just want to move forward, as we all do, for the sector and
Keep
try
it
and
at
get
that,
this bill
gentlemen.
done.
Thank you, Mr. Davidson. Thank you, Mr. McGregor. We'll now turn to Mr. Steinley for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to my friend and colleague, Scott Davidson, for being here this fine evening. And you did mention something in your comments which agriculture producers really don't see that often, and that's certainty. You said they're looking for certainty in the market and being able to ensure that there's money there at the end. And being from Saskatchewan, there's a lot of agriculture in my background. I grew up on a farm as well, and that certainty is there for certain areas of the agriculture industries. For example, there's crop insurance, and there's the Western livestock insurance. So do you kind of see this being on the same lines as that certainty for other agriculture producers? And that just makes it, like you said, a more of a level playing field for the fruit and vegetable growers across the country?
No, well, thanks for the question. I think certainty is key now, especially for this market. We Yves and Alistair alluded to the comments that, farmers, what they go through at the end of the day to make this carrot. I think tonight in the House of Commons, they're debating hybrid parliament. There is no hybrid farming. This is a boots on the ground, hard work industry from 5 in the morning till, 8 at night, 7 days a week. The food terminal is going. This is a massive job to feed Canadians and to, literally feed the world. And, again, this is a sector that I think deserves that financial security for sure. It's something I want to see. If you look at other industries, again, alluding to dairy, pork, chicken, whatnot, they all have their sort of, call it their security. I think this is one sort of, niche of farming that's never had anything. And I think it's a huge growth sector for Canada that, as Canadians and as, again, a vision for the country that we have to get behind and drive this agriculture forward.
Sorry. So would this just protect growers, or would it protect wholesalers and other areas of the fruit and veggie?
No,
industry?
all fresh produce. You know, it was asked. The bills here. I know you're going to be doing a line by line on this committee. This is for fresh fruit and vegetable growers. Is what this is for.
Thanks. And just for some of the people watching the Ag Committee, as you said, you're a ferocious reader of our report, so I'm sure there's lots of people that are watching Ag Committee at this hour as well. And to put it in context for agriculture in Saskatchewan, if you unloaded a truckload of cattle and your buyer that ends up not paying you for them, you can still go back and get those cattle back. Same as if you drop off a load of grain or a semi-load of canola. And I think that's what we have to make people aware of is, you're right. Once the lettuce is off out of the field and off the truck, you have a week or so to make that sale. And if you make that sale and that money doesn't come into your pocket, there's no other way to replace that. So I think that's the picture I want to paint for people that might ask why we're dealing with this at this time, because there isn't that certainty, to go back to my earlier comments. And just to add on that, and that's where I would say when we're dealing with important issues in the Ag Committee, just to make people aware they're watching, like, that's why we need something like this. You said earlier the Liberals had committed to this in 2015. Our friends in the NDP committed to this in their 2015 platform. So that's 8 years from now. So I think this is time that we can get this done, and you bring it forward as a private member's bill was the best option for us as opposition to push for that. So just a couple of comments around there.
Yeah. No, and thanks for the questions. You know, again, a carrot is not the same as a cow. Blueberries are not the same as a cow. And that's why this sector, call it a niche sector in farming, is our fresh fruit and vegetable growers. We take that whole sector for granted. You know, you go in the store, go buy your fresh produce. You know, let's go to the farmer's market, pick up your fresh produce. It's always there. And this is why this industry is looking for this security, and why it's so important.
Yeah, and I'll just end with this. And you made your opening comments. 3/4 of our fresh produce is imported, and in a country like Canada, where we have so many arable acres and the opportunity to produce our own food, we do have to make some changes so that we have that opportunity stays in Canada, and we can have more people that are going to produce food so that we aren't reliant on other countries.
In about 10 or 15 seconds, please, Mr. Davidson. I know you can do that.
Mr. Chair, with the gavel, the change starts now.
There we go. Okay, Mr. Turnbull, over to you.
I don't know how you follow that, but that was almost borderline weird. Never seen a man with a carrot in committee before, but you do a fine job, Mr. Davidson. And honestly, I really appreciate you being here tonight. I appreciate the efforts you've made towards drafting this bill. I think you're using your private members' bill spot to do something good for the farmers in your community, which I think is a great thing. I drove through Holland Marsh on the weekend up to see my mom for her 80th birthday, and every time I pass through there, I think how beautiful it is to see that black earth, and you know, just how much grows there. It's a beautiful place. It really is, and we need to preserve it. So I do appreciate your efforts here, and there's a part of me that wants to just sort of take this back and sort of say, okay, this is you know, a farmer, a fruit and vegetable grower is going through a bad situation. Essentially, they're having to file for bankruptcy and go through insolvency, and essentially the intention of this bill, if I'm not mistaken, is to make that bad situation just a little bit better. Is that right?
Yeah, for sure. Sorry, I missed that.
Essentially, this is a bill that makes that bad situation that farmer is going through, which is essentially bankruptcy and insolvency, and make it just a little bit better for them.
100%.
Essentially, they're able to cash in on the value of their produce to pay off the creditors that are standing in line waiting for liquidation of all the assets that they have, right?
Well, I wouldn't call it cash in. They're getting paid for all their hard work, the days and nights that they've had out in the field. And remember, you know, let's take a medium-sized farm, for example. I mean, whether you want to call it big or little, we can take the Leamington case. You know, if a smaller farmer in my riding doesn't get paid, say it was, you know, And the way inflation is now, when I talk big numbers, $2 million, it's not a lot of money. Everyone knows that at the table. But remember, that farmer is also responsible for fertilizer, the corrugate, the fuel, right? There's a whole supply chain situation that goes on with that farmer. If he doesn't get paid, none of those other people get paid.
So essentially, the way I read the bill, though, is that instead of the produce and the sale of that produce being way down the line, in other words, it not being able to be used effectively to pay off creditors, it essentially puts it at super priority status, like right at the front, right? So that they can sell that produce and use the proceeds from that to pay off some of the
they become a secured creditor, if you want to look at it that, preferred creditor. You could call it super priority.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. And so that sounds great. I can get behind that, because I think why should they experience a loss on top of already having to go through bankruptcy and not being able to utilize the produce that they've worked so hard to produce to help make that bad situation just a little bit better? Is that sort of, am I getting it correctly?
No, you're
just very general terms.
In very general terms, yes, they become a secured creditor. Now, like I alluded to before, if they sold $10,000 worth of produce and they don't get paid, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to get $10,000 back either. It depends what's in that company, but they are going to get priority over someone else.
Right. And what I like about this is it's sort of similar to other things that we've seen in our parliament, where we've been able to work together across party lines to ensure that creditors in the insolvency process are fair for, pensioners, for example. We worked on another bill together, which was really great to see. And this seems to be another one of those that there's unanimous support for. So that's a really good sign. What is, just for interest's sake, Mr. Davidson, what does the Ontario Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association have to say about this bill? Are they supportive of it?
Very supportive. I think you're going to hear from them. Ryan, I know you are, and I am. I'm a big believer to listen to the boots on the ground people, and I think they are here tonight, Mr. Chair, various witnesses. So, you're going to be able to hear right from them.
Great.
We're going to, sorry, Mr. Trimble, we're actually at time.
No
maybe
problem.
10 seconds.
No, it's okay.
Watch.
Thanks.
So
Thanks,
we'll have to
Mr.
leave it at that. Monsieur Perron, 2 minutes 30 secondes, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Perron for 2.5 minutes. Mr. Davidson, when you say that produce growers' life conditions are difficult to begin with, well, I would like to add on to that. I'd like to share something that I experienced recently. I got to spend an evening with produce growers in Quebec, and it ended quite early, even though it was going very well. People went to bed very early. Do you know why? Because the day before, it was minus 4 degrees Celsius, and most people didn't sleep a wink. Some people slept 2 hours, some hadn't slept at all, in order to water their land and try to save something. And they were trying to maybe start harvesting over again. This is a question of resilience. When we talk about climate change, water is going to be a very important issue. Droughts will be very important, and we see it in our forests. These people are constantly exposed to these risks. I'd like to repeat something you said earlier that I liked a lot. This industry deserves safety and security. An element I'd like to insist on is that there are producers and there are also retailers. A lot of producers rely on retailers for their sales, and this is something that we have to explore a bit more. How do we protect our producers better? So if we allow reimbursements to retailers through the law, then that money has to come back to the producer. I wonder if you had thought of that a little bit.
So first of all, on your comments about farmers and our fresh produce farmers in their industry, I always say, especially when I take people out into my riding into the Holland Marsh, I say, look at their hands. And I can tell you right now, if you look at the hands of farmers in my riding, they are all callous. We call it, it's marsh dust that comes up. And when the harvest is on, all you see is the whites of people's eyes, and these people are literally working till midnight with the lights on, harvesting. It is a stressful job. Back to your comments about climate change and people being worried about, am I going to get the rain I need? Am I going to get that? Because once they lose a season, there's no redo. That crop's year is done, and it's done. So back to
Mr. Davidson, I apologize. We'll have to leave it at that,
Okay.
Unfortunately. But I appreciate it. We'll now go to Mr. McGregor.
Yeah, just a quick question, Mr. Davidson. Like in the 42nd Parliament, we had an individual, Mr. Ronald Cummings, appear before the committee, and he had worked, I guess, with a draft of this law. Did you ever take a look at his draft, and is the Bill C-280 in any way similar to what he had come up with? Or are you familiar with the work he had done previously?
Yeah, my office had spoken to Mr. Cummings on a couple of occasions. I think this bill that was drafted, that's in front of you, 280, the first and foremost thing that people have to understand, and I think we have a witness here that's going to be able to explain it if you have those questions a lot better than me. The U.S., under their constitution, is set up different than Canada, and I think that's what Mr. Cummings was referring to, how legislation would work like this in Canada, and that's why we worked with Fred Weber and others to make sure that this legislation respects provincial jurisdiction, first and foremost. This was written respecting how Canada's constitution and Canada's law and only federal jurisdiction. So and again, we did consult with them on that.
Thanks, and maybe I'll just end with a comment. When I was a teenager, I got to work at a local blueberry farm. It had about 5 acres, but if you can see, I was about probably the foreman on that operation, and you spend all this money getting to a couple of short weeks in July where all hell is let loose, and anyone who's picked blueberries under the hot July sun can appreciate how quickly they can go bad on the bush, never mind in the store shelf. So I'm grateful for that experience, and I also want to add my personal thanks to farmers in my region. I think what we've got an opportunity here with this bill, this is a way for parliamentarians to all come together and set up a system that gives them some certainty, and I think that's kind of the theme word of the day. So thank you, Mr. Davidson, for appearing.
And thanks very much, and thanks very much to the committee and the members. And Peter, let's get it done.
Thank you very much to you two. Finalement, pour le conservateur, Monsieur.
For the Conservatives, Mr. Liu for 6 minutes to end. Thank you very much. Thank you to my colleague. Everything's going to be all right. Thank you for presenting this bill. It is a very important bill. My question has to do with the finances. Do you believe that among the people that you've interacted with, that this will be a positive step in obtaining credit when they will go and meet up with their financial institution? When you don't have a guarantee or predictability, financial institutions often are somewhat skittish. Do you think that this bill will reassure bankers and allow our farmers better access to credit?
100%. I think when there is that certainty in business, and let's be honest, we've got trying economic times right now, and especially for farmers, whether it's increased input costs, again alluding to corrugate, and climate change, and that different banks being worried about different things with different farmers. I think this is one piece of legislation that would give certainty to creditors, to say, that person's receivable is going to be backed by this deemed trust, that Bill C-280 that we're going to come out with. So I think it is actually going to help the industry immensely. It's something that, again, fresh produce farmers have been waiting for, and it's time to get it done for this committee for sure.
Merci de la réponse.
Thank you for your answer. You mentioned that agriculture is very important and that we have to pay particular attention to it, and that is what this bill does. Do you think that it will encourage smaller or medium-sized producers? Because most of the time we have bigger producers. Do you think that this bill will be positive for smaller and medium-sized producers, or at least encourage them to start their production up again? As my colleague mentioned, a lot of produce growers across the province and elsewhere transferred their production into cereals and other kinds of industries. Do you think that this will have a positive impact to allow small producers to grow their own produce again?
No, thanks for the question. I think definitely throughout Canada, it's going to allow our small farmers to possibly become medium-sized and our medium-sized to become bigger. Any little competitive edge now, this is, the world now is so global, so competitive. Any little edge that we can do as legislators here to give our agriculture sector, and our farmers, and here tonight, our fresh produce farmers, a leg up, is much needed for the industry and much needed for the country. And, I think this is one piece of legislation that is going to encourage growth in that sector.
Merci. Est-ce que dans la...
Thank you. In the same vein, do you think it's an important step that we're taking with this bill? Do you think that maybe later right now, small and medium-sized companies are kind of getting crushed under certain. There are bigger companies that are crushing them a little bit. Do you think that this will improve that situation?
I think it'll give someone like the farmer I spoke to earlier, Ken, that much needed leg up that says he's going to stay in that business and push forward instead of giving up. Again, every little, piece of legislation that we can pass in the House of Commons, it's going to help any farmer, any the little guy, to get a leg up. It's going to help them, right? And I hope to help a whole bunch of Kens.
Great. We'll leave it at that. We now have Mr. Drouin. You're going to lead off, and colleagues, I'm just going to take a little bit of time at the end to ask a few questions myself, but go ahead, Mr. Drouin.
Sure. Thank you so much, Mr. Chair and Mr. Davidson. It's great to get a second round of questioning in there, and I'll be short and sweet. Just I previously addressed the supply chain, and the way you have addressed the bill, mentioning suppliers, that leaves the entire supply chain open to potentially your bill. Are you in favor of that? So meaning from and I know the intention of the bill was to protect growers and fresh producers, but you could actually open up to potentially having retailers protected under that. Was that the intent of the bill, or would you be supporting a friendly amendment to ensure that we're actually truly protecting producers? And this is just left up to interpretation, for instance, right? Because at the end of the day, if this goes to court, we want to make sure that producers are really well protected.
That is a common sense question. Yeah. And you know what? This was intended financial protection for the producers, for the fresh fruit and vegetable growers. That is the intent of this bill. If we have to work on the wording, I believe that the legislatures, this is a robust bill. But if there is wording that needs to be looked at by the committee, I'm, happy to look at that.
Mr. Chair, you'd be happy to know that I'm already done. Over to you.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Davidson. And again, I'm in support of the concept of where this bill is the intention, but just a few technical questions. Do you have a copy of the bill in front of you? I think we left one there. And I appreciate, Mr. Davidson, that we'll have a legal technical team in front of us, but just so I can be sure I'm on your intent, on 81.7 sub 1 and clause A, it seems to suggest that the supplier, in this case, as Mr. Drouin was talking, your intention is the grower, so we want to make sure that it's the farmer themselves. They would have the ability in their invoice to actually have a clause that would say that they want to, in the case of a bankruptcy, avail themselves of this protection, or once the bankruptcy has happened, they would have up to 30 days. Is that your understanding of that provision?
Where is that? Where?
So
Sorry.
81.7.
Yes.
It's on page number 1 of the bill, right under
Yeah.
short title. So on clause A.
Yeah, the supplier is included in their invoice and notice, that part?
Yeah, and so just so we're clear as the committee, is the intention there that if I'm a farmer and I'm selling to a retailer, I could put in my invoice a clause that would say, in the event of a bankruptcy, I intend to use this provision, this right that I have, or if it's not included in the invoice, within 30 days of understanding that a bankruptcy could have happened, a farmer can apply and put in notice that they expect to be paid. Is that your understanding of what that clause is?
It is.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then on B, this would just simply be to say that after 30 days of invoking that intention in a bankruptcy situation, that essentially the purchaser would have to pay the entire amount owing.
The 30 days.
Okay? Or that when so what I'm getting tripped up on is on C, where it says the purchaser, trustee, or receiver, obviously trustee or receiver would deal in a situation where there is bankruptcy, does not pay the supplier the entire balance owing when it becomes due as provided in the invoice. But that's referencing the actual piece in a situation of bankruptcy, not just a situation where a purchaser has not paid and is not in a bankruptcy situation.
Correct.
Do you follow me?
Yes, I follow.
So this is only applying in a bankruptcy situation, not just when a company may have not actually paid their bill.
This is a bankruptcy
That's your
situation.
understanding. Okay,
Yeah.
good. And then the second question I had was around perishable fruit and vegetables. Is it your understanding in the conversations you've had with the industry, and I take notice they're going to be on next, so we can ask them this question as well, but is there a working definition of perishable fruits and vegetables, or is it just kind of a common sense, strawberries, carrots, something that could be perishable, or is that a technical definition, or do you know?
It's actually, if you look under definitions in 7, perishable fruits or vegetables includes perishable fruits and vegetables that have been repackaged or transformed by the purchaser to the extent that the nature of the fruits or vegetables remains unchanged.
So like if this carrot was cut and repackaged, but it's still carrots,
It's
then
still
that
a
applies.
carrot. Yeah.
But
If you made soup out of it and now you're selling soup, it's not its original thing.
So the intent of the legislation is specific just to whole fruits or vegetables that are not otherwise processed in any form.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's helpful.
Yeah.
Okay, that's all I had in terms of technical questions. Thank you, Mr. Davidson. I'd like to make a motion maybe ask the committee. We've got all this lovely product from York Simcoe. I think we should put it together as members of parliament, and we should take this to the Ottawa Food Bank or some local food bank and donate it. Is that something we should all do? Good. Okay. So colleagues, we'll work with the clerks and the analysts to do that. Thank you, Mr. Davidson, for bringing it from your, as you call it, the salad bowl of Canada, York
Soup
Simcoe.
and salad.
Oh, soup and salad. Oh, Jesus. Sorry.
It's all good.
I'll
get you the T-shirt. It'll have Gwilly on the front.
I would like that T-shirt. Colleagues, we're going to just break for a few minutes. We'll come back with our second panel with our witnesses, but thank you, Mr. Davidson. get back with our second hour. Thank you for the quick turnaround to our technical team. So, colleagues, we have 4 different witnesses for the second hour of our panel. We have appearing as an individual Fred Weber, who is the past president and chief executive officer of the Fruit and Vegetable Dispute Resolution Corporation. I believe he's joining us online. Yep. And from the Canadian Federation of Agriculture, we have President Keith Curry. Welcome in the room. And we also have Brody Berrigan, who's the Director and Government Relations of Farm Policy. Welcome as well. From Fruit and Vegetable Growers of Canada, Dr. Rebecca Lee, who's the Executive Director, and Quentin Woods, both of whom are joining us here in the room. So thank you so much. Et avec l'Association des
With the Quebec Produce Growers Association from Quebec, Catherine Lefebvre, President, and Patrice Léger-Bourgoin. Welcome to the committee.
Remarks, and we should have enough time for 2 rounds of questions. So I'm going to start with Mr. Weber. Over to you for up to 5 minutes, please.
There we go. Had trouble finding the mute. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee for this opportunity to speak with you regarding Bill C-280, Financial Protection for Fresh Fruit and Vegetable Farmers Act. As you indicated, I retired as the president and CEO of the Fruit and Vegetable Dispute Resolution Corporation in 2021, having been a part of the DRC since its origins and inceptions nearly a quarter of a century ago. The DRC is currently embedded in the Safe Food for Canadians Act and is a requirement for most firms who purchase and sell fresh fruits and vegetables. I continue to consult with the DRC as needed, and I'm available to DRC members as an arbitrator. Prior to moving to Canada in 2005 and becoming a dual Canada-U.S. citizen, I was at the United States Department of Agriculture, specifically with the PACA, the Perishable Agricultural Commodities Act branch. My entire professional career has been spent resolving payment issues in the fresh fruit and vegetable sector. My specific involvement with financial protection for Canadian farmers in relation to insolvent buyers began in the late 1990s as the DRC was being formed. The DRC founders set out to establish a mandatory dispute resolution system, dedicated inspection service, and an insolvency tool such as we are discussing today. Today, only the insolvency tool remains outstanding. When a firm ceases to operate owing money and becomes insolvent, the DRC has no way to help recover any dollars owed. This legislation would provide our farmers with an opportunity to recover at least a portion of their livelihood. Frustrating our farmers further is that Canada and the U.S. had specific programs available to each other for the resolution of fruit and vegetable trade disputes. Canadian farmer rights in the U.S. have been restricted as the Canadian system does not offer a comparable assistance to U.S. farmers. For many, this development has closed opportunities to expand and prosper. Why has this important risk mitigation tool continued to stall? I believe it is misunderstandings and an unfamiliarity with the sector. I would offer a few examples just as an explanation of why I believe this tool has been around for so long or been studied for so long. In the beginning, a study was put forth indicating that the U.S. model of a deemed trust used taxpayer money to pay farmers whose customers became insolvent. It is now well established that no taxpayer money is involved in the U.S. PACA model and that research was an error. There was also, as was mentioned previously by Mr. Davidson, there was a significant misunderstanding with regard to Canadian and the U.S. constitutions. The Canadian farmers were familiar with the PACA model and wanted to follow it closely as a basis for the Canadian model. We now understand that unlike the U.S. model, familiar or similar legislation in Canada cannot come into play until an insolvency occurs and federal jurisdiction has taken over. This is not a problem for the industry. It has often been stated that protections for farmers already exist in the Canadian bankruptcy regime. I believe it has now been well established that those provisions simply do not work for produce given perishability, supply chain processing, and other identity issues. Another reality we have faced is the lack of viable information. I can verify that StatsCan and the Superintendent of Bankruptcy have valiantly tried to help. It is unfortunate their systems lack the granularity to provide the specific insolvency information on fresh fruits and vegetables. Reorganizations and receiverships further complicate compiling meaningful data. Extracting unreported business failures also has been unsuccessful. In my experience, the most compelling reason for this legislation is the number of firms who simply close their doors and walk away from their business. This is a regular occurrence. In a typical scenario, there will be several farmers owed money. They do not know who else is owed money, nor do they know if another creditor has taken the assets. Without this information, they are not able to spend the significant dollars to investigate, place the firm into an insolvency position. With this legislation, a farmer would have some assurance of being treated fairly. Thank you again for this opportunity, and I will look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Weber. We'll now turn to the Canadian Federation of Agriculture, Mr. Curry and Mr. Berrigan for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. As most of you here know, I am Keith Curry. I'm president of the Canadian Federation of Agriculture, and CFA represents about 190,000 farm families and farmers and ranchers right across this country from coast to coast to coast. I want to be very clear from the outset that we are absolutely in support of C-280. It's a bill that personally I've been advocating for many, many years, and I want to make it clear that we are certainly in support of it. And while this bill would provide the much-needed financial support to our fresh fruit and vegetable sector, which supports nearly 250,000 jobs in this country, it is about much more than that. C-280 is about preserving the fiber of local and rural farming communities, maintaining the integrity of our food supply chains, and supporting Canada's domestic food security. As a farmer myself, I understand that risk management is a big part of what we do. And from the moment that seed goes in the ground or if that calf is born, there is a risk that I won't see a crop at the end of the day, or I won't see that calf mature into a milker or head to market. However, unlike cash crop, livestock, or supply managed producers in Canada, fresh fruit and vegetable producers carry additional risks and costs that are unique to the production of perishable goods. These producers typically don't see a return on their investment until the product is sold and payment is collected long after the farmer has passed on their product. And what happens when those suppliers go bankrupt and can't pay the farmer, or simply walk away because they can't turn a profit? The farmer doesn't get paid, and the Bankruptcy and Insolvency Act does not provide effective protection for fresh produce sellers in Canada due to the high perishability of these products and the industry's longer payment terms. You simply cannot repossess spoiled fruit or recover your losses, as we've heard at length tonight. The government has put forward solutions for other sectors within agriculture. For example, the Canadian Grain Commission holds roughly $1 billion of financial security from individual grain license holders to pay grain sellers in case a grain buyer becomes insolvent. However, no such financial security exists for the thousands of small and medium-sized fresh fruit and vegetable producers right across this country. Bill C-280 would establish a critical financial protection mechanism for fresh produce sellers in Canada to help secure payment in the case of a buyer declaring bankruptcy. It's a tailored solution to a clear gap in our risk management toolkit for Canadian producers. We must remember that these farmers play a vital role in supporting and supplying local communities with safe and nutritious food and vegetable products. In a context of escalating food prices, increased costs of production and supply chain dynamics that are threatening Canada's food security, we can really afford to leave these producers exposed any longer. Our members across the country are strong supporters of Bill C-280 and look forward to this bill being passed as quickly as possible. Thanks for this opportunity and look forward to questions.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll now turn to the fruit and vegetable growers. Dr. Lee or Mr. Woods, over to you for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Bonsoir. Good evening. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee for the invitation to appear before you today. Quinton and I appreciate this opportunity to address you on behalf of the fruit and vegetable growers of Canada. I'm Rebecca Lee, Executive Director of the Fruit and Vegetable Growers. FVGC represents growers across the country involved in the production of over 120 different types of fruit and vegetable commodities, over 14,000 farms. We are here today to express our strong support for Bill C-280, the Financial Protection for Fresh Fruit and Vegetable Farmers Act. As you all know, the produce sector has been pushing for this for many years. We greatly appreciated the support we've received from the committee members from all parties on this initiative. Speaking on behalf of Canadian growers, we strongly urge all parties to see to it this bill passes swiftly so that it can provide the necessary safeguards to our growers in what is surely a volatile and uncertain time for our industry. Our sector is quite unique and differs from other commodities in that our products are highly perishable and our window for sales very narrow. This is why the existing protections for agricultural products in the Bankruptcy and Insolvency Act are not adequate, and in the event of a purchaser's insolvency or bankruptcy, our growers are left with limited recourse and significant losses. A key aspect of this legislation is that once the proceeds from the sale of fresh produce are deemed to be held in trust for the supplier, they are not included in the company's property. This is significant because it means these assets would be protected and does not take away from other creditors' ability to access their claims in the event of a restructuring or insolvency. This not only provides growers with an additional layer of protection, but it is also an instrumental tool in ensuring fairness and equitability in these often complex dealings. Additionally, the definitions included in the legislation consider the realities of our industry, acknowledging that the fruits and vegetables might be repackaged or transformed, yet remain the beneficial property of the supplier is an important detail. I will now let Quintin Woods, FEGC's Trade and Marketing Working Group Chair, explain further.
Good evening. As Rebecca said, my name is Quintin Woods. I am Fruit and Vegetable Growers of Canada's Trade and Marketing Working Group Chair and the Sales Manager of a root vegetable operation, Gwillimdale Farms. Gwillimdale is a premier grower of packer shipper of root vegetables located on the northern tip of the Holland Marsh. Bill C-280 is a topic which I am highly passionate about, and I want to point out that this proposed legislation could pave the way for reinstating the Perishable Agriculture Commodities Protection, or Act protection for Canadian growers by the United States. PACA had been a crucial protection for Canadian growers, ensuring prompt payment and offering a dispute resolution mechanism. The loss of this privilege in 2014 because of the lack of reciprocity in Canada dealt a significant blow to our industry, exposing our growers to increased financial risk. Gwillimdale's operation was directly affected in 2014. Coming out of the recession of 2009, a U.S. customer with whom we had done business with for many years stopped paying us. We were left with no choice but to launch a formal complaint through the PACA, or against this company through the PACA in the United States. Unfortunately, the day in which we filed the formal complaint, the United States pulled reciprocity for Canadian sellers. That meant we were required to post a bond for twice the value of our claim. At that time, our claim was worth $100,000 US, and we were required to post a bond for $200,000 US. We were not in the position to post the bond at that time and were forced to walk away from our claim. If Canada had implemented a system prior to revocation of reciprocity, we had been able to continue our formal complaint without posting a bond. The proposed legislation would be of no cost to the government, as they would not be required to carry financial liability or backstop any losses. However, it will provide significant benefits to growers, and one could argue it is a form of business risk management, but one that requires no government funding. This legislation offers a framework that bolsters the stability of our industry and promotes fairness in business practices, ensuring the viability and growth of our sectors for years to come. FEGC sees this bill as a game changer, providing our members with much-needed protections and possibly leading to greater market opportunities. We urge you to consider these benefits as you deliberate on this legislation. Our members depend on it, and this bill will bolster the strength and sustainability of the Canadian produce sector at a time when it is sorely needed. And we cannot forget that the benefits are not restricted to our growers. A more robust and secure Canadian produce industry, backed by these protective measures, would help address growing concerns of the Canadian food security and food sovereignty. Thank you very much for your time and consideration. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Right on time. Et finalement, Association des producteurs maraîchers.
And finally, we have the Quebec Produce Growers Association with Ms. Lefebvre. Thank you for your time. Quebec's market garden sector covers some 36,500 hectares and generated more than $500 million in revenue in 2020. The Association des producteurs maraîchers du Québec is responsible for market access and for creating the conditions for economic success. In particular, we operate the Place des Producteurs in Montreal, one of the country's largest distribution infrastructures for fresh and fruit vegetables. And growing, harvesting, and packing and marketing fresh fruit and vegetables entails substantial production costs and high capital investment. What's more, producers and sellers of fruit and vegetables destined for consumption by our neighbors to the south face additional financial risks due to a lack of financial protection in the event of bankruptcy of American customers. Roughly half of Quebec's vegetable production is exported to the United States. Fresh fruit and vegetables are not like other fruit products like canned goods. They are highly perishable, which means it's impossible to salvage and recover the vegetables in the event of, or the produce in the event of non-payment. This is the crux of the problem. The federal government's current rules severely restrict the ability of producers and sellers to obtain compensation if the buyer declares bankruptcy. In practice, sellers have no protection. In the U.S., if a fruit and vegetable buyer goes bankrupt, growers and sellers can rely on trust provisions of the U.S. PACA Act to obtain payment. In this country, our growers and sellers have no payment protection in the event of bankruptcy, which can result in disproportionate financial risks. The perishability of fresh fruit and vegetables makes producers particularly vulnerable in Quebec, where 70% of farms are less than 5 hectares in size. When produce buyers become insolvent, unpaid vegetables are worthless. In short, the lack of financial protection puts the country's horticultural producers in a position of great financial vulnerability for 3 main reasons. First, the risk of not being paid for the produce they have grown in a context where the substantial increase in costs at production has significantly diminished profit margins. Second, the imbalance in commercial risk management with the United States. And third, inaccessibility to reciprocal preferential protection when exporting to the United States. Implementation of the bill would give priority access to cash inventory and accounts of an insolvent customer to help offset losses associated with a product delivered but unpaid. Also, as explained by my colleague, the introduction of a financial protection mechanism in Canada would open the door to the restoration of preferential treatment under the U.S. PACA. This preferential treatment was in place prior to 2014 when it was cancelled by the U.S. due to lack of reciprocity. We need to protect the supply chain. If one of the links is not paid, the effect ripples through the whole system, right down to the family farm itself. In this context, the seller, even if they are an intermediary, must be able to count on protection, and the producer, if they go through a third party, must benefit from the domino effect in order to be paid. It's worth mentioning that once the law is enacted, the government will no longer have a direct role in the insolvency process, nor will it assume any financial liability as a result of the bill passing. The bill does not oblige the government, and therefore the taxpayer, to compensate or support farmers' losses in the event that a buyer cannot meet its obligations. In essence, the model proposed by Bill C-280 reflects the parameters of an effective model used in the United States. It presents a financially feasible solution that imposes no additional burden on government. By establishing this safety net, another step towards the adoption of Bill C-20 will have the effect of greater predictability and stability for businesses. In conclusion, we wholeheartedly support Private Members Bill C-280. Thank you. Thank you very much. And now we will start with our question period. Ms. Root for 6 minutes.
Thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Coming from a produce background myself, I know people in the industry. I've worked with them for years, and they're some of the most resilient people I've met. They're also some of the biggest risk takers that you will ever meet in this country. And if we think about it, every person on this planet consumes fruit and vegetables, and that's the reality. And that's how important this industry is to the people of Canada, to the people of the world that we feed. And that's why it's so important, I think, that we need to make sure our farmers can stay in business. And this is another tool that they could have in their toolbox. And we've heard examples, and I've seen examples in the industry, and we heard tonight, that not every farmer will claim bankruptcy. They may just walk away. And that also impacts other farmers, because growers tend to work together with other growers, with wholesalers. We sell to folks who resell. So Dr. Lee, I just wondered if you could let us know what you've been hearing from the growers out there. Is this bill needed? And we've heard a little bit. And how will this legislation promote certainty for our farmers in the fruit and vegetable sector here in Canada?
Thank you very much for your question. I've been hearing right across the country that it is extremely important to have this support for our growers. We did a campaign. Some of you may have received letters from constituents in your ridings. Over 320 have come in, and I think that is, considering that what farmers do is actually farm, it is quite substantial, the number of letters that have come in. So that is one evidence of the support for it. It's been mentioned before that the supply chain here roughly supports 250,000 jobs. Having this bill will allow the food system to be much more resilient, and it will provide the financial certainty for one of, as you mentioned, an essential sector, and essential not only for the economy but for our health, fruit and vegetables. It's going to enhance the affordability, accessibility of fruit and vegetables to Canadians across the country, and as has been mentioned, will not cost the government anything. And then, as we've heard also, it will help to reinstate the PACA in the United States so that growers who want to expand or who are doing business in the United States and depend on that market can also be sure that they will be paid down there as well.
Thank you. I'm going to turn my attention to PACA. And Mr. Wood, you mentioned in the United States, when growers are selling into the United States. Currently, our produce growers have no mechanism for dispute resolutions in the U.S., and that does affect whether growers may choose to sell to the U.S. or they're taking a bigger gamble if they sell a bunch to the U.S. and it is a high cost commodity, like you mentioned, $100,000 on your farm, but that was years ago. And now with price inflation and food inflation and costs, it goes higher up. So can you just elaborate a little bit more on how this will help protect Canadian growers who export to the U.S., because a lot of our produce is exported to the U.S.?
Yeah, thank you. For sure. One thing we have to realize in today's marketplace is we continue to consolidate our marketplace. So our receivables and our sales to specific customers get larger and larger. So when I talk about $100,000, that was in 2014. That claim in today's environment would be well over $1 million. So through the U.S. right now, we do have some sort of protection, but we have to post a bond for double the value of our claim. Unfortunately, most people, when they haven't been paid, cash flow is very tight, and a lot of the times that bond is extremely difficult to post. So it could lead to dire situations like ours, where it potentially could have been a lot more harmful than what it was, because a lot of the times you're doing business upwards of 10, 20, 30% of your total sales to a single customer, and if that customer doesn't pay you, it can be very harmful.
How many farmers would you suggest that this would affect, that export to the U.S.? Do we have a statistic or a number of produce farmers that may export?
I'm not sure we have that specific number here today. We could get it for this committee, but just from looking around in our industry, I would say that most of the packers, marketers, grower packers would export some sort of volume to the United States.
Thank you very much for those answers. How has the lack of protection impacted sales to the U.S.? Do we have an idea? Has there been reservations from the United States of wholesalers doing business with Canadian farmers?
I think we have to flip the coin here, and we have to look at the United States. Fortunately, there's still some access, whether we call that access or not, to the United States PACA system. But what we have to look at is are we actually looked at as a potential market for U.S. shippers? Because currently there is no protection here for U.S. shippers. So we have to look at to see if we're a market that attracts interest from shippers in the United States, as Mr. Davidson alluded earlier, 3/4 of our lettuce comes from outside this country. So we have to make sure that we continue to have access of those vegetables from the United States.
Thank you very much, Ms. Rood and Mr. Woods. Mr. Turnbull, 6 minutes.
Thanks to all the witnesses for being here today. This is an important conversation. Mr. Weber, maybe I'll start with you. Based on your experience in dispute resolution, how do you anticipate this bill will impact disputes between suppliers and retailers?
Suppliers and retailers in the U.S.?
No, in Canada.
It's a very difficult question. The DRC has been set up and operating for a long time. And I will tell you that and before I retired, most of the problems that would come up regarding dispute resolution or payment issues between farmers and the large retailers were really resolved through informal mediation. It operates much the same way as PACA in the United States does. These are business people. They'll listen to reason. You've got a neutral party in the middle who knows how the game is supposed to be played. If they're confused about what their deal was, well, there's default rules. The DRC has default rules. PACA has default rules. So I don't think that this particular legislation will have an impact on dispute resolution per se. As I mentioned in my opening comments, where the change is going to come is that if somebody won't pay, and they're just adamant they won't pay, the DRC can take away their membership, which means they can't buy and sell produce anymore, but they can't enforce any payment. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Yes, it does. And how will this bill affect the operations of the Fruit and Vegetable Dispute Resolution Corporation, in your view?
Well, it's going to, the DRC and the PACA have had a long history of working together. In fact, the PACA actually handles a few of the disputes for the DRC, and then we talk back and forth regularly because the systems are so common. As this reciprocity returns, there will become more U.S. members. There will be more applications to DRC to resolve disputes, and that's all good stuff. Because as Quentin was mentioning, this is not a one-way street. The relationship between the U.S. and Canadian growers is very important. Canadian produce flows south when there's an abundance of Canadian produce, and we make up for the shortages during that long, cold Canadian winter with product from the United States. So overall, it's going to make everything better.
Thank you for that. And Mr. Curry, if I have any time left, I'll ask you a quick question. From the CFA's perspective, how will this bill potentially impact the agricultural sector in your view?
Well, I think the thing that we need to realize, and it's been spoken about tonight already, is that this is about risk management. It really is what it's about. Growers across the country, regardless of whether you're growing livestock or produce crops, from the time you put the seed in the ground or you propagate plants in a greenhouse or breed cattle or livestock until that product is matured, there is risk involved, but there's manageable risk. There's tools available to help you minimize that risk. When it comes to the hort sector, once that product leaves the farm, then you are the only risk tool that's available. You have to self-insure the risk, and there's a lot at stake for our producers. So, like I said, I've been involved in this farm advocacy game for almost 40 years now, and I spent a lot of time in the province of Ontario and through the organizations there, and it's been something that's been desperately needed for nearly a decade now. So, it's very important to our farmers.
Thank you. And do you see any challenges in terms of the implementation of this bill, Mr. Curry, that you foresee? I mean, we're having an open conversation, so if you do, it's okay. Like, we can work through it. I think there's a lot of support for this bill.
Yeah, I think it's inherent on this committee to work with both the industry and Mr. Davidson, the proponent, to make sure that the I's are dotted and T's are crossed, and make sure that the bill's as good as it can be. There's always, unintended consequences, but get it as right as you can, and more importantly, let's get it in place now, and you can always fix it afterwards if there's problems that you see going forward with the way there's language or whatever. But yes, let's get it done.
How much time do I have, Chair? Oh, perfect. I got more time than I thought. Wonderful. The luxury of time. It doesn't usually come easy around here. Ms. Lee, maybe I'll ask you a question. How do you anticipate this bill will impact the trade and marketing of perishable fruits and vegetables?
I think I will actually turn that over to Quintin. He's more of a marketer than I am. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I truly believe that this would help, promote and increase our trade, both domestically and abroad. This is a bill that would offer, people peace of mind and allow them to sleep at night knowing that they have access to some sort of money at the end of the day. The reality is, 10% of your payable could keep you living for another day. And that's the protection that we don't have now. Most of our growers in bankruptcy are walking away with nothing. So
it's really about risk management and financial stability for our fruit vegetable growers. Is that right?
Absolutely. I mean, the reality is we're talking high value crops, the necessity of life, the basics, fruits and vegetables. And I think, our growers just want peace of mind and insurance that they're going to get some sort of payment at the end of the day.
We'll keep it at that.
Thank you very much,
you are
Chair.
at time. Thank you, Mr. Turnbull. Thank you, Mr. Woods. Maintenant, Monsieur Perron, 6 minutes.
Now on to Mr. Perron for 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and to the witnesses for being here with us today, either in person or online. We all know that you have much bigger things to take care of back home, so your time is precious. Ms. Lefebvre, Mr. Bourgoin, I talked about something earlier with Mr. Davidson. We didn't have time to really finish on that. We were talking about who are we protecting, and Mr. Drouin referred to that. Is it the producers that we want to protect? I know a lot of you work with retailers. In case there is a reclamation, who are you protecting? It's not a domino effect. Once the products have left, they are very perishable. Once they reach the first buyer, we don't know the rest of the domino effect. That's why it's important to protect producers first in this entire bill. That's why it's important to go to the very bottom rung. So we'll make sure to write this in the right way because it's very important to identify this. I also asked another question to Mr. Davidson. One of the things we oppose is the 0.1% of reclamations statistically. We got to the conclusion that it is not very, that is somewhat untrue. Do you have any recommendations to make, Mr. Lefebvre and Mr. Léger or Bourgoin? Any producer will want to take their profits to invest into a market that already exists. For example, an export market to the United States, which does exist. The bankruptcy situation does exist, but there is also a latent situation. When a business is not doing well financially, things can unravel quite quickly for that producer. Right now, a producer who is looking to enter the U.S. market has 3 possible reactions. Either they give up the American market and therefore to a potential of 332 million people because the risk is too high, or follow the line of credit of its client very closely, and anytime there is a liquidity issue, they will break their business deal or link. And as you mentioned earlier tonight, they'll accept payment conditions that are lower because they can't recall the product that is perishable. We hope that we can quickly adopt this bill. We're talking about also reestablishing PACA with the United States. In your sector, standard reciprocity is brought up a lot with regards to what's coming in from outside. There's a lot of exports, and should we request the same thing? With regards to financial reciprocity, you're aware that U.S. producers have better protections if they are not paid. Do you think that you are on equal footing with the foreign competition? Not at all right now. This reciprocity does hurt us, and the reciprocity with PACA does not exist right now. It does mean that we are dealing with very specific issues with regards to how long this will last, as you mentioned earlier. So no, we are not on equal footing. So this bill would be very positive. Any other thoughts or comments on the importance of this bill and adopting it? Something that was not brought up, perhaps, that you are concerned about in the first few months of applying or implementing the bill? Essentially, it is urgent to act and to give us the financial protection measures that are necessary and that C-280 talks about. Production costs are increasing rapidly and have been for the past 2-3 months. The cost of transportation and diesel to send produce to the United States have increased drastically. So the risks taken by our sector are higher than ever in Canada. As you mentioned earlier, there are extreme weather events that can provoke considerable losses in just one night. It is ridiculous to think that we can keep having access to a market that is as interesting as the U.S. market without protections for this industry. Thank you very much. Mr. Perron, you have 10 seconds left.
Finalement, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. McGregor. And to end the first round of questions, Mr. McGregor, for 6 minutes.
Much, Mr. Chair. Thank you to all of our witnesses. And Mr. Curry, I think this is your first appearance as president of the CFA since your inauguration. Anyways, I just want to offer you congratulations, and you're certainly no stranger to this table. I'd like to start, actually, my first question to you. As president of the Canadian Federation of Agriculture, you're kind of flying at 30,000 feet, and you have the bird's eye view of the entirety of Canada's agricultural sector. And there's a lot of support for this bill around this table, but at times we kind of have to play devil's advocate and try and think of maybe what would some of the objections be. I think we've heard a very real and solid case for why this bill is necessary for the fresh fruit and vegetable sector, but some people may ask about other perishable products in other sectors. Such as, dairy, eggs, various meats. Now, some of those sectors are under supply management, which has its own ways of doing things. But maybe as president of CFA, could you respond to maybe some of the concerns that might be raised about other perishable products in other sectors?
Well, certainly there are risks in all aspects of agriculture, no question about it. But in most other industries outside of horticulture, there are protection type of assets available to producers in various different types of ways. There's business risk management tools, there's insurance that you can buy. So there are options for growers and producers that they can purchase or they can secure to at least minimize the risk of growing that product. Whereas with horticulture, that's not so much the case. And not only would this bill ensure that financial protection, but let's not lose sight of the confidence that it gives growers to go forward, to not only grow for the year, but to look at growing my business, expanding my business, and the economic input that has not only from the immediate rural area with further employment, but all the communities that it's going to support and grow down the road, as well as a food security issue, both domestically and internationally. So that's why this bill is important. And you're right, there are other products out there, grown agriculture products that do face risk, but those other products along the way have some tools available to them that can help support the minimization of that risk.
Great, thank you very much for that. Mr. Weber, I'd like to turn my next question to you, and this may allow you to expand on your opening statement. Our committee in the previous Parliament, when we were looking at business risk management programs, we came out with a recommendation, one of several recommendations to create this statutory deemed trust. In the government's response to that particular recommendation, they said, and I'm going to quote from the response, quote, "Under the Safe Food for Canadians regulations, fresh produce sellers and buyers who trade interprovincially and internationally are required to be members of a single dispute resolution body, the Fruit and Vegetable Dispute Resolution Corporation. This in itself provides additional protection for our fresh produce farmers and sellers." Do you have any additional comments in response to that particular couple of sentences we saw in the government response to our recommendation?
I think it's an accurate statement as far as it goes. Certainly, the DRC provides dispute resolution, but this bill is not about dispute resolution. This bill is about getting paid when there's been an insolvency. So I don't have any problem with that statement. The DRC is a very important to the industry. It's quite frankly satisfies part of PACA's requirement to return reciprocity with the United States. But again, the DRC cannot do anything with an insolvent firm.
Yeah, so if I'm interpreting you correctly, that in itself is not a statement that could be adequately used as an argument against C-280. It's great that that exists, but additional protections are needed through C-280.
Correct.
Yeah, thank you for that. For my next question, just for the fresh fruit and vegetable growers, I know, because of how connected our two economies are, Canada and the United States, you have a lot of contacts down south, and that may also involve with members of the government, United States Department of Agriculture, members of Congress. Is there a guarantee that if we do embark on this path of getting C-280 passed into law, that we will regain preferential status under PACA?
I mean, as Mr. Davidson said earlier, we cannot speak on behalf of the United States. To the best of our knowledge and what we have been told by the United States, it would definitely open the door to reciprocity again.
And if I could possibly redirect that to Fred Weber, because he's been more in contact with the people that would be able to answer that.
Sure, Mr. Weber, if you want to jump in.
Sure. Thank you, Rebecca. There's no mystery about getting reciprocity back. It doesn't require Congress. It doesn't require anything. The Perishable Agricultural Act itself provides that if another country has a system that is deemed to be equivalent to theirs, so the DRC satisfies part of that, and if we had an insolvency tool, it's automatic. Any other country, Mexico, Chile, South Africa, if they want to put in a DRC and come up with an insolvency tool, they too could be granted reciprocity under PACA. I'm not sure where this idea came from that it requires an act. You're right. I worked at PACA. I know a lot of the people. We've had letters assuring us that if this happens, it really is certainly a senior.
Monsieur Weber, désolé, c'est le temps qui était imparti à Monsieur.
I'm sorry, that is all the time we had for Mr. McGregor. On to Conservatives now. Ms. Rood for 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
So we are set to lose 40% of our farmers in the next 10 years. That's a staggering statistic that we've heard recently. In many cases, the next generations in produce farming are not choosing to be in the business because of the risk that's associated with this industry. And this is going to affect our food sovereignty. But this bill provides another tool in the toolbox for our growers, for next generations who are growing perishable products. Now, not all growers sell to grocery stores, and some sell to wholesalers or some sell to brokers, and it's common practice in this industry for this to take place. So not all packers of produce are growers. So perhaps Mr. Woods or Dr. Lee, can you tell us why this bill, why it's so important that this bill should apply to suppliers and not just to growers?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I think that's very important. The reality is, the growers are the lowest common denominator on the totem pole. And there's been mentioned many times over the last couple of years, a lot of what we do in our business is low margin. So as we transact throughout the supply chain, we need to make sure that the next step in the supply chain is also covered, because if we are selling to a wholesaler who sells then to a retailer, the retailer goes bankrupt, that wholesaler would need access to ensure that money trickles back to the grower. So I think as the bill is written, produce growers and sellers, I think that is a very important statement, and it's something that we would definitely support.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn my time over to Mr. LaHoo, Chair. Thank you.
Actually, I'll assume that for the moment. Mr. Weber, you were finishing a question to Ms. Rood. Sorry, to Mr. McGregor. Can you please complete that answer?
You're on mute, Mr. Weber, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think I lost my train of thought. It really was that there's nothing magical. There's nothing magical about this. It's a stroke of the pen. Do you satisfy the requirements under the PACA? Don't you? And right now, we've been told that if we have an insolvency tool, we satisfy it and we get it back.
And that would then also be extended to other countries that would meet that same threshold, correct?
But that's not, in reality, that's not likely to happen. I mean, the U.S. and Canada have had, regulatory backdrops for fruits and vegetables for, going on 100 years. No other country really has come forward and done the dispute resolution or had the kinds of grade standards or the kind of cooperation that the U.S. and Canada. So yes, it's possible, but not very likely.
Thanks. I'm going to direct the next question to the panel in person here. In a previous life, I spent some time in the processing vegetable industry, negotiating contracts where terms of payment were very, very important. And we examined competing jurisdictions with their own rules, and we found that Midwestern states often had protections for primary producers where they placed them in a super priority position or not just as unsecured creditors. Can you talk about the implications? Have the banks pushed back here in Canada at all? Have you had any negative pushback, let's say, because of the super priority positions as you've represented your stakeholders? Maybe we can begin with FEGC, sorry, that still does not roll off my tongue. CHC.
Thank you for the question. We have not had pushback. Informal conversations would suggest that certainly like in the United States, having a strong client is in their interests, and that's about all the discussions we have. We haven't seen any pushback.
Okay, thank you. Anything, Mr. Curry? In 10 seconds, my colleague does have one question yet.
Very quickly, in our brief conversations with some financial institutes, this isn't an issue at this point, so it's not a concern yet.
Excellent. Thank you. Mr. LaHoo.
Merci. Ma question, Madame Lefebvre.
My question for Ms. Lefebvre. You mentioned that produce is exported to the United States. 70% of farms have more or less 5 hectares. Do you think that this bill will help smaller farms become medium-sized farms, for example, and just to grow in general? Our current fear is to just lose farms. If this bill only works on durability, guarantees durability, then that will actually help us maintain the industry. Thank you very much, Mr. Lew and Ms. Lefebvre. Mr. Drouin for 5 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Just a question on, I think you've mentioned it just takes a checkbox mark in order for the U.S. to recognize Canada's system, but I've been around this place for a long time, and it's, well, not that long, but certainly worked with government for a long time, and I know it's never as simple as just a check mark. Do you understand the U.S. process into ensuring that we do get the recognition, the reciprocity? Because I think that's the whole point. Part of it, anyways. It's an important criteria for us to support this bill, and I think that's what the Ag Committee was asking for because of the unfair treatment that they were getting down south. you have any advice for this committee in terms of who we may invite just to get assurance that we will get this recognition down south? Maybe former colleagues or?
I'm a little hesitant to name names in this forum. I would much rather get back to
We'll just summon you. Just kidding.
Having been, and as you look at my age, and I'm retired, you can imagine that a lot of the senior public servants within PAC are people I know very well. One of them rose to a level just below the secretary. It is an administrative decision. I would suggest to you that you could reach out to any senior agricultural person in agriculture, and you'd get that same reassurance.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Mr. Woods, you've certainly talked about the fact that exporters to the U.S. have to double, in some circumstances, double the bond. Can you talk to me about what that means for businesses in Canada when you have to, essentially guarantee double of what you're selling down south, and the impact on cash flow? And
yeah, so the reality is you're already in a claim position because you haven't been paid, and then for the duration of the claim, you have to post a bond for double the value of your claim. If a claim's 500, you have to post $1 million. If it's $1 million, you got to post 2, which then further takes that cash from your cash flow. Almost, I would go as far to bet that it would be almost impossible for most growers, most marketers, most packers to post that bond in that situation in the current environment. Growers are being forced with high expenses, and our profit margins are not brisk by any means. So I would say that cash flow would be very hard to post that bond.
okay, and obviously we've talked about the objective of this bill, and we've talked about the supplier relationship. Do you see any scenarios where retailers could be in a supplier position defined by law, or for instance, I can think about many small businesses buy from Costco, for instance. They buy supplies from Costco. Would that allow them to be in a supplier position?
I think the reality is, in that position, the retailer is point of sale. They're getting purchase. They're getting their payment at the cashier. So I don't see how that would put them in a position to make a claim on a restaurant or a wholesaler or a jobber by any means. There could be certain situations in which a retailer could become a supplier. If a large retail distribution center is providing an independent retailer with vegetables, they most definitely could become a supplier, rightfully so. But those situations are probably very few and far between. The reality is our expectation as fruit and vegetable growers of Canada is all produce sellers along the supply chain should and be protected under this legislation, and if they happen to be a supplier, then rightfully so, they should be protected.
Okay. And from your understanding in reading this particular bill, growers and greenhouse growers would be protected under C-280?
Absolutely, yeah. All growers, produce, fruit, and vegetable growers across this country, including greenhouse growers, would be included in that legislation.
Okay, thank you so much. Merci.
Okay, we'll now go to Monsieur Parent pour 2 minutes 30 seconds.
Thank you very much. Miss Lee, I asked people from Quebec earlier, and it seemed unanimous. Is it the same in Canada? Is there that same sense of unanimity? Does everybody want this bill to be adopted? Absolutely. This situation is recurrent in all provinces. We have letters from all provinces. In all the meetings, in our annual meetings, producers talk about it, and they definitely need this bill to pass. We mentioned difficulties earlier. There are some producers who don't harvest their land or even sow the seeds, and they move on to other types of produce like cereals, have you seen that kind of things? Does that reduce the amount of fruits and vegetables available in Canada?
But there's a number of reasons why growers could leave, and there's a lot of uncertainty in the sector, from getting the labor they need, from getting the inputs they need to be able to make sure that they are able to sell their product and all their product. We've seen stats on food loss at the farm level. All of those inputs that they are not able to get or people to harvest influence on the amount of product that they're actually ending up to be able to sell. And if they don't have the certainty of being able to get paid, that is just one more aspect that they have to worry about. And I mean, we can start on talking about mental health. That's a whole different story, but there definitely influences on there as well.
Inaudible for the interpreter.
Et à moi que vous êtes adressé, M. Perron?
Am I the person you were talking to? Mr. Curry.
Could you repeat the question? They didn't interpret it.
Ce que je demandais, c'est...
What I was asking was, with regards to the challenges and transfers, do you have anything else to add? I only have 20 seconds left.
No, I think Rebecca covered it quite nicely. I mean, this is an important bill. We need this bill.
Okay. Mr. McGregor, take us home. 2.5 minutes.
Take us home.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'll save my last question for the fruit and vegetable growers. And I do want to, again, read from the government response to our recommendations. And I do want to note that our recommendations have had all-party support. So that includes Liberal members of Parliament. They have been unanimous. And I think our committee's frustration has been with the government. So I do want to acknowledge that, while legislators, we have been doing our work to try and get this. Our frustration has just been with the government. But I just want to read a quote. So in that response, quote, the government stated, to date, there has been insufficient evidence provided to support changes to the insolvency legislative framework. Insolvency losses within the Canadian fresh produce sector are small, with total losses to all creditors in fresh produce insolvency making up less than 0.1% of total sales in recent years. So I guess I'll just open the floor to you, because I think this is kind of the crux of the matter of why we're here, depending on a private member's bill. What is your response to that government response to a clear recommendation?
Thank you. I think it's tangentially at least been discussed a number of times how farmers find it easier just to walk away when they're not able to put a complaint through the process. But perhaps Quentin could go more into that.
Yeah, thank you for the question. As Mr. Weber said in his opening statement, a lot of time in this industry, the growers don't know who the other creditors are. So it's hard to form a bankruptcy class. So what happens is a lot of the times there's businesses that just go bankrupt and walk away. So a lot of the statistics are flawed in the fact that they're not capturing that. In our township alone, in the Holland Marsh, we've seen 3 instances of that in the last 10 years.
Yeah. I think Mr. Weber had made reference to the Valiant Efforts stats. Canada has tried to get the correct stats, but just when no one reports them, you can't bring them out.
When there's no true bankruptcy or insolvency, it's hard to report stats, right? Yeah. So I know of 3 situations where people just walked away, closed down their business, and started again. Those did not get accounted for statistically as a bankruptcy.
Right.
So there is a lot more bankruptcies within the sector.
Thank you for clarifying that.
Thank you, Mr. McGregor. Thank you, Mr. Woods. Colleagues, that brings us to the end of our second panel. But on behalf of all of you, I'd like to thank our witnesses for making the time this evening, those who have joined us online virtually and those who had the opportunity to be here in the room. Thank you for your respective work in the name of agriculture and our farmers across the country. Colleagues, on Wednesday, we will be we'll be drafting our environmental contribution of agriculture report for version number 1. We don't have enough time today, but I would ask, I know Mr. Barlow's not here, but Mr. Perron and Mr. McGregor are, and indeed Mr. Turnbull. We should have just a conversation offline about what next week could look like. There is some uncertainty with, of course, the House proceedings and how long we will be here. My desire would be, if we are able to get the report done on Wednesday, we can have a conversation if you want to do something next week. Otherwise, we could make sure we resume our activities when we come back in September when the House returns. So we can talk about that offline. I hear everyone talking, and we'll go from there. Thank you, everyone. Good night. Meeting adjourned.
Merci de l'invitation.
Thank you.